Hey, good evening and welcome everybody to the City of Lake Forest Park joint meeting with the Planning Commission for Tuesday, January 13th. With that, I will call the meeting to order. Won't wrap this table too hard. I might hurt myself. I'd entertain a motion for adoption of the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Any questions, comments? Hearing none, it's adopted by unanimous consent. Thank you, everybody. So nice to see you all here tonight. Glad everybody could get together and on relatively short notice this year. Welcome to 2026, where I hope we all have a whole lot of optimism for what's going to happen in the future. And I think there are lots of wonderful things that are happening due to the great work that the volunteers and you all are doing. So, and the new council as well. So really appreciate all your efforts here. We only have one item tonight, of course, and just for the edification of the people that are watching and the public, this is going to be a joint meeting with the city council from 7 to 8 p.m. We will then adjourn from that, and the planning commission will continue on with their regular business from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. And again, it's a joint discussion regarding the planning commission. I'm going to hand this over for you're on, sorry, I'm distracted. You're on green because there's too many of us. For Deputy Mayor Furtani to facilitate the discussion with Vice Chair Goldman. So welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Planning Commission, for being here with us tonight. Really appreciate you, all the work that you already do. And part of the reason we were calling this meeting is because the City Council understands that you're impacted in terms of the workload you have. There's a lot of different topics now that the legislature has passed so many bills regarding housing and zoning and things like that. And so what we were trying to get a sense of was what your workload was and, how much, I hate to call it that, but spare time that, you have in the committee to basically consider some of the council's priorities. And so one thing I wanted to read out, just because this was the hardest thing to find, and Director Hoffman, thankfully, was able to find it. It's literally, what is the Planning Commission for? I had tried to find a simple statement of it. It was really hard to find, but it's in our, what is this called? The Lake Forest Park Volunteer Commission System. It's the one that we're supposed to give out to all the volunteers on our commissions. And then it says Planning Commission drafts the city's comprehensive plan and makes recommendations on the zoning code and related land use policies. So it's a pretty broad mandate, and I think it's good to keep all of us to keep in mind that that's our boundaries tonight, is to just discuss those kinds of things. All right, so at this juncture, I wanted to turn this over to our Deputy Mayor Goldman, or sorry, Vice Chair Goldman. I elevated you. Sorry about that. Okay, and he's going to lead the discussion on some of the questions we have for you.
All right. Yeah, and thank you for being here, for having this joint meeting. I think the way I envision it is sort of two parts. So the first part, I think we benefit from hearing from the Planning Commission. What are some of the core tasks that you need to do this year? So are there time-sensitive items? I know in 2024, it was the comprehensive plan. In 2025, there was the climate element. And so are there certain things that the Planning Commission really needs to do that's a high priority item for 2026? And then the second half, I was thinking we might just go around the table, all of us, and kind of share what do we envision, maybe one or two items that, bandwidth permitting, we'd like to see the Planning Commission take on. And so I would like to turn it over to Chair Castic to kind of talk about what it is you're working on this year.
Thank you for the reminder. I invited my fellow commissioners to chime in if I missed anything, but as I was saying, at our December meeting, we had just begun to start to talk about our priorities for the year. And Mark had shared some recommendations of things to consider that were required statutorily or by code, or that otherwise might have been desired. And from that discussion, we had planned to come back this month, kind of align on a plan and a roadmap, and then share that with the council for input. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. I think that'll shortcut some of that discussion. But what we talked about last month, we talked about three items that we understood were perhaps mandatory or desirable. Those were addressing the PSRC transportation certification comments on the comprehensive master plan. The thought was that might help make us eligible for certain transportation-related grants if we had that certification. So we had planned to put that into the book of work. Open question of whether or not we needed a consultant to advise on that, but that was pending council input on whether that was something that was desirable, whether seeking grants for transportation-related issues was desirable, and whether or not that would be helpful. Two other kind of major development regulation updates that we understood were either past due or required by law. And that was first the critical areas ordinance mandatory update to the Lake Forest Park Municipal Code. We understand that was due to be completed by December of last year, but we didn't meet that deadline given the other workload. So we thought we would pick that up given that it was required. Also an area where we would likely need a consultant. So I think there was an open question for the Planning and Development Department of what leftover funds were left from 2025 that we might be able to tap into, and then what funds might be available for us to have a consultant if we needed a consultant to help with that major regulation update. And then as a follow-on item for that, we discussed addressing the Shoreline Master Plan mandatory update. I understand this was perhaps due in June of 2019 and not completed perhaps at that time, but with then further update due by June of 2027 per state law. So that we talked about from a sequencing standpoint of being something that could follow on to the critical areas ordinance update, given that there would be some potential overlapping work, or that might give us the context from which to understand how to do the shoreline master plan update. So those were the three that we talked about. We talked about a number of other issues as well. A carry-on item from 2025 that we understood was a council priority was looking at affordable housing. We've had a lot of discussion about that. Do we mean capital A or lowercase a? Capital A meaning affordable housing for low-income people, and incentives that we might be able to have to increase and preserve the supply of affordable housing for low-income people. And then lowercase a, as we talk about it, meaning what can we do to increase the supply of smaller scale housing that might be more affordable to first-time home buyers, whether or not they're low income, and are there incentives that we could look at? So that was another topic we've talked about and wanted to have on the radar as something that we might continue on pending council input. We then had a number of other ideas of things that we talked about, some parking lot items, some other major development regulations that we understood some were past due or some were mandatory, but maybe not yet past due. And then some other kind of cleanup items related to the comp plan, including regarding action items and implementation items related to the climate element, and then some other comments to address from the King County Housing Authority, and then chapter additions with the comp plan amendment that was done in 2025. So that's what we've talked about, and I'll just pause there to see where you'd like to go from there. And welcome any comments from the fellow commissioners of things that I may have missed.
I think I'd just like to make a comment coming back to the mission of the council or the committee is that I think the leadership. I just want to acknowledge the leadership that's really kept us within those parameters. I've been here. I think Maddie and I have been here the longest, and I can say with a lot of confidence that we have stayed within those parameters. So I just appreciate the leadership that you've brought to the council, to the committee, keeping us on track within these parameters.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think you've given a great summary of a potential work plan, and I don't think anybody on council would disagree that these are necessary items. So I think what we'll do then is dive into what Vice Chair Goldman, who I'm just about to turn it over to. Yeah, go ahead.
I actually had a follow up on one of the things. So I am one of the members. There's the Seashore Transportation Forum. King County divides itself into three regions: North, South, and East. North King County, which is us, Shoreline, and Seattle, is part of the Seashore Transportation Forum. And as part of that, Mayor French is also a member. And part of that is roughly once a year, we evaluate PSRC grant applications from member cities. And that's the sort of thing. And to my knowledge, we as a city have not put forward one of these grants, but I would really like us to consider it. And if it's a critical prerequisite is for us to go through this plan in order to remain eligible, I think that is a high priority.
Yeah, and thank you, Vice Chair. That's a really on-point comment, and I think that's part of what you were discussing with trying to basically make sure that we're in line with any kind of grant opportunities that may come up. As you know, we're going to be hiring a climate coordinator, and certainly there's going to be some opportunities there. It sounds like what? Climate has something? Yeah, of course, because climate touches on so many things like housing, transportation, and so forth. So I think there's some exciting opportunities here. So I think in line with what the Vice Chair was saying, I'd like to go ahead and basically see, let's start with basically something that you've been discussing recently, which is frontage. So I have not been on the Planning Commission. I don't know what your workload is like, but I'm just using this item as a jumping off point. What kind of workload do you expect from that? How does it fit into your larger plan? And how does it, with these three large items you're talking about, will it help with any of those three items?
I think it's a good question. And at our last meeting, we talked extensively, continued our conversation about lot frontage requirements. There's three zoned areas in the city where there are minimum lot frontage requirements before development can occur. And these happen to be in our larger kind of lot zoned areas. And we've been talking about that quite a bit. The consensus of the commission at the last meeting was to roll that into conversations about a broader update that would address affordability, because we saw some of the policy motivations behind that as related to affordability. So that would be part of a broader look at affordability and what are there kind of cleanup things we could do in the code or incentives that we could do in the code to incentivize affordability, capital A and lowercase a.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great thing to start with. All right, I think one of the things that the Vice Chair was also saying is that we also want to get a sense of the timing of these elements. As you mentioned, a couple of them are mandatory. Had you already gotten some kind of map of the year about when you would be attacking some of these? The first three certainly, and maybe four and five.
I don't think we had gotten that far yet. I think it was pending some input that we were going to discuss with Mark today about how much time should we be budgeting for each of these items? Do we need consultants for them? What would be the lead time to bring on the consultants? Is that something that we need to get approval from council on for allocating more budget or signing the contract? So that was part of the discussion that was planned for today.
Great, that sounds good. And I'm going to ask this question now because I don't know I'm going to have a chance to ask it later. But there's some thought that basically a monthly meeting may not necessarily be enough to tackle some of these larger issues you're talking about. Are you thinking about having a bi-monthly schedule at some point?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one of our agenda topics for today. Our vice chair suggested at the last meeting that we have an agenda topic to talk about frequency of meeting. We had a preliminary discussion about that at last meeting and decided to have a more formal discussion about it today. We had talked about, do we do a bi-monthly meeting every other week? Do we do a monthly meeting and then a bi-monthly kind of working group meeting? So those are options that we were planning on discussing today. I did just some basic benchmarking with cities in Washington that are of same size or most similar size. I looked at the 10 that are most similar and found that Snoqualmie does meet twice a month. Liberty Lake meets twice a month for 10 months and once a month for 2 months. And then the other 8, Ridgefield, East Wenatchee, Woodinville, Edgewood, Cedar-Woolley, Enumclaw, Newcastle, and Kelso each meet once a month. So it's something we'll be discussing, but would very much welcome a steer from the council on if you would like us to meet more frequently and if that's something that you'd like us to consider.
And that's something. Yeah, I just want to point out that And I was the one who recommended that we go to a more frequent meeting. I've served on another planning commission in the past when I lived in Shoreline. They met every other week. And sometimes the meetings were much longer than 2 hours. And I think we have a lot in front of us, which is why I feel like we simply don't get enough time in these once a month, 2 hour meetings. And I also, and not that it's certainly appropriate to look at similarly sized cities, but there's also a lot of things that apply in Puget Sound that don't apply in other places. So looking more at, I mean, if you look at our neighboring cities, yes, some of them are bigger. Like Shoreline's bigger, still not a huge city, but they do, I think it's still every other week. Kenmore, I think, is twice a month or every other week. So I find we spend a lot of time kind of catching up, a month away from an issue, you spend 20 minutes just remembering where you are. You spend the last 15 minutes of the meeting discussing where you want to go next, which leaves you not much to actually wrestle. And I think these things are important and they need airtime. So that's where my recommendation came from. But I just wanted to clarify that, why I made that recommendation.
Appreciate the clarification, and trust me, the council does not take lightly the volunteer commitment, and really, really appreciate what you all do for us. And to ask more time of you, to me, is on, it's almost like the last step. Really, if there's any other way we can avoid that. But I like the fact that you're proactively discussing whether or not it is appropriate to meet more often, and I appreciate the thoughts you put into it. Okay, so I think at this point, I'm going to open the questioning to the whole council. And if you all have questions, we're not talking about our priorities yet, but basically, if you have any questions about the planning commission processes, meetings, that kind of stuff, topics, that would be great. Go ahead.
Well, and just a comment continuing on the conversation about meeting frequency is for us to consider, as well as staff support time. That doubles the amount of kind of support time that is provided to you, which is good. But it also is an extra time that our staff have to fit in the place. So I think continuing this conversation, and if you guys want to make a recommendation, and we'll, lean heavily into your guys' suggestions, I'm sure. But I always want to make sure that we're not overworking the city staff as well. So whether that means pulling back on some of our ideas in order to find that balance, I just want to make sure that we have a balance.
Connected to some of these same thoughts is that you were mentioning the big A affordability and small A, and how the frontage comes into that. A lot of the other items in your parking list, and certainly on my list, also touch that. And I wonder if with things like that, where it's hard to bite that apple, right? Because it does touch so much. If more frequent meetings make that easier, hold more in your head, does it slow things down? Does it just add to the workload and then everyone's distracted? How that balances out? If you have twice as many meetings, do you get twice as much done? Do you get more done because you're more efficient with that time? Does it clog up staff time, which we want to be respectful of? How does that all play out?
Yeah, I think, and I don't purport to speak for the commission, so I welcome other members of the commission if you have a different point of view. But the staff kind of workload is a key concern, and it is something we talked about briefly last time. There was a question from Mark about, would there be enough bandwidth to prepare for this? And he said, well, sure. It's just, what do we take off of our plate to be able to do that? I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Mark, but something along those lines. And Mark provides us absolutely terrific support. But it is a lot for him to coordinate the work that we're doing and to give us the information requests that we have and to follow up on everything. So it is a fair amount to manage. I think personally that, to Yane's point, if we were to be meeting twice a month, and if we were to have, the staff support all to be able to make quorum, so that we would have quorum each month. And I know for some of us, sometimes that's a challenge, even with the monthly meetings. It could be much more productive. And particularly if, as we had consultants on the things that we needed consultant support for, they were able to quickly turn around kind of the support that they needed. I do think there is an opportunity for greater productivity. I don't know if I would say it's going to be double the productivity, but it would certainly be more if we all came prepared at each of those meetings, if we had the support and if we were able to kind of keep momentum. I do kind of recognize what Yane said, and I do agree with it. There is a little bit of a lost kind of context when you're only meeting once per month. So I see that as well.
In terms of the volunteer commitment and the staff commitment, is there some of the work is that sort of hands-on, you need the staff information, you need it's all of those different parts coming together, and some of it is that more conceptual work. Is there room for a committee structure that maybe not everyone has to meet twice a month if that's burdensome, but that keeps the work moving forward so that those full meetings accomplish perhaps more, and keep you caught up with the mandates as well as anything that we might push to your direction?
I do think that if there were every other week kind of working group meetings or smaller group meetings where people could move the ball forward on some of this stuff, that might be a little more productive. Sometimes we get into what I would call a drafting by large committee scenario where we're all here kind of catching up to Yane's point on, spending the first 15 minutes catching back up on context. And then we're all as a whole commission kind of debating and drafting, stuff from whole cloth. I think that's a little less efficient than if a smaller group would get together and 2 or 3 of us could come up with, here's a draft, here's how it tracks to the principles we've talked about. What do you think? And we could move the ball forward that way. I do think that would be a little more productive. But with optionality to have a twice monthly meeting where maybe, for 2 months, we need 2 times a month because this working groups have all done the work that they need to do. So I think something like that might be a little more productive, but I know we haven't really had a full commission discussion on this yet.
It will really depend on the issue, right? So it could be something that's requires more time. And if that's the case, then we've talked about options of meeting as a committee or as a whole committee twice a month, or committee work, breaking into groups.
I want to go back to critical areas for a minute, since that seems to be touching a lot of your segments. So it looks like you're looking at the critical areas ordinance, and what does that include for people that may not know what it is you're considering around that? Because I think that we have a lot of critical areas in our neighborhood.
Yeah, it's a good question, Councilmember Good, and I think we need a little more exploration on that. So this list came from our discussion with Mark, and what we understood is that entire ordinance is required to have a fresh look. I don't think there's anything specific that we've talked about as a commission that we want to be an area of focus, but if there are mandatory updates we need to make to comply with applicable law, that's what we would want to be focused on. As I understand it, the critical areas ordinance is focused on, it's kind of the baseline level of requirements that apply to all of the critical areas in the city, which, as you know, are quite large. So that's as far as I know at this point.
Okay, the follow-up question. It would be good to know if our critical areas, if we have an adequate GIS for them, or if that is something that we have to do better at defining where are our existing critical areas, because that would seem to help with people that are trying to build in those areas.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thought, Councilmember Good. And yeah, and we'll be working, of course, closely with our GIS vendor on a lot of these kinds of projects. So definitely stay tuned on that. Thank you all. And I want to make sure that our folks on Zoom, Councilmember Muhlenberg and Commissioner Larson, if you had any comments, you're welcome to chime in too.
Thanks, Tracy. I'm wondering about the makeup of the commission. Is it fully staffed today? And do we have a couple of alternates that sit on this commission, or are there vacancies that exist? And does that impact the workload?
It
Mark,
does. We're down 2 people. Go ahead, Sam.
I was going to say, are we down 2 people, or did we recently
2.
appoint somebody who hasn't yet attended?
We have 2 vacancies out of 9, and then we have 2 that are, I'll classify as terming out in end of March. Thank you.
And then to the question of, does that affect the workload? I think if we were to move to like a working groups kind of structure and to try to make progress on a couple of issues at once, certainly being less than a full commission is going to impact that.
So I've been on the commissioners probably 2.5 years, 3 years. Anyway, so when I was approached about it, I was told that it was once a month. And then last year we went to twice a month because of the workload. And so now we're looking at twice a month again. And I know for a fact that I won't be able to participate. So I just want to say that, being a volunteer, I feel like this is kind of really change. And that could be the reason why, we're not getting more volunteers.
And I appreciate your comment. I remember, I think Commissioner Cleno remembers the town center process where I believe the planning commission met twice a month for something like 6 months, right? Or something like that. And that was a very, very heavy ask. So, and that was tough on a lot of the commissioners. So we're very cognizant about asking you to, this is one of the reasons we're holding this meeting is to make sure we stay within your bounds, your personal limits. So thank you. Okay, Commissioner Larson, go ahead.
Yeah, I just, sorry for being a few minutes late. I wanted to say this is wonderful that we could all meet and talk together just to get, I think, clear on what our priorities are. Having been on the commission for some time now, I think more so than any time in the past, I feel like we're really on our back heels on a lot of things. We have more work that needs doing in our city than we have time as a council or as a commission. And I think to Sherry's point, the part of the challenge too is that we're headed into some territory that really requires some expertise and innovation that I mean, I'm personally motivated to, flesh out, and I'm hoping that meetings with council can help us prioritize this need for more innovation in the way we look at housing to ensure that Lake Forest Park, in the face of changes coming out of Olympia that have come and continue to come, could yield the type of housing we want. And I can't say this enough. We know the kind of housing we're going to get because Bothell, Kenmore, Shoreline are years ahead of us on this. And so, how can we work in ways that create innovation where we can all be on the same page to be great environmental stewards and get that diversity of housing we need to be a good place for young families to start, people to age in place, people from different economic, strata to participate in housing in our community. And so I just want to say we are really stretched. And I think what we really need is just a very sharp focus on some of our biggest opportunities here in our community, because as you can see from this list, we could focus on, too many things and not get anything done well. So I do think we need the discipline to agree that like the thing that we need to accomplish as a collective body in this next year is really, I would say housing, but I don't have the full view that you all have. So I'm hoping that this conversation might reveal what like our top two priorities are so that we can focus sharply on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, clarity. Okay. Councilmember Riddle.
I was going to comment in terms of working. An advantage of the subgroup approach is that it lets individual commissioners sort of dial in based on their availability. That if one commissioner really only has the bandwidth to maybe join one subgroup and another commissioner has more free time, they could do two or three. It lets people kind of choose based on their availability, their passions. And so it builds in some more flexibility compared to a very rigid, we are going to all meet these days. So I think there's some perks to having these subgroups.
And I think as those of us on council are coming up kind of with our ideas, I know that, Councilmember Bolden and I kind of tried to flesh out some of these ideas before we were like, okay, is this really worth pursuing? So I think, if if it becomes someplace where we can partner up, if we can flesh things out first so that we're much more clear and more precise about what we're asking of the planning commission so that you guys can roll more quickly into sort of more of the meat and then confirmation of what it really means. I think there's definitely an opportunity for some of us who have specific interests to do our own little subgroup and hand you something that maybe is a little bit more put together. Because I think we have our ideas, but there's obviously the work that just has to be done, all the mandated work. But we still want to see somehow we get some of our cool ideas to you in a way that you guys can actually handle it and it won't overwhelm you.
Thanks for that. And one of the things I've thought about in terms of this meeting and what would be helpful from council is, we have just spent a lot of time on sort of middle housing, and we passed what we sort of needed to pass, and we left a lot of things sort of unresolved. For example, we said, yes, we would allow things like cottage housing, but we sort of stopped there, and absent some incentives or whatever it is, we're not going to get any, right? I mean, because you need to provide some incentive to get that type of housing if that's what you want. So what I would love for us to have from council are just, little more kind of, hey, we'd really like to see you guys dig into this aspect that you kind of left on the table a little bit. You said we'd like to see cottage, but you didn't take it further. And we didn't have time to. I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm saying we didn't have time to. But if the council feels strongly that, maybe, and that's just an example, it could be something else, but to just say, hey, can you give us something in this, look at a range of options that would get us, something to really chew on with respect to, let's say, small scale housing as the one example, that would be really helpful. The other thing that I think, and really this is more of a question to council, is that we've struggled sometimes with, do we do little surgical strikes to fix a problem or fix something that we think needs fixing? And I've been a little bit of an evangelist on the frontage issue. My fellow commissioners can attest to that. And I wish we would just fix it and be done. And the argument or the consensus where we've landed as a group is that, well, let's bundle it with other things that are related to, say, development. We've talked about side yard. So there's some quirks in our side yard setbacks that really can cause some unfortunate outcomes when people redevelop certain lots. There are other things. There's things about, reasonable use, there's a lot of little things. So my question, and I don't know if you have an answer tonight, would the council like to get, kind of like, here's a fix for this one thing, or do you want a package that deals with all the things that we think might need attention in the code? Because those are different, those have kind of different maturity dates and different levels of complexity. And I'm not arguing for which one's right. I think we would benefit from knowing what you want to receive from us. Fixes of little things, or this is, here's the world of things that we think should be fixed.
So Maddie has.
Well, I just want to add, yeah, thanks. I wanted to add on to what Yanni was saying. I think he's getting to the meat of what I hope can come out of this conversation with you. We've talked about for a number of years about having like pre-approved plans for ADUs and DADUs. Should we focus on that? Should we focus on putting cottage housing, recommendations into play? Should we focus on fixing underlying code? But again, we just can't do all of it. And I think that's sort of what would help with this middle housing piece that Yanni was talking about, that we've sort of put a pin in because we just didn't have the time. I think to bite off all of middle housing is probably impractical. And so where is their appetite on council for particular types of housing, middle housing, and how might we prioritize that that aligns with what you're more inclined to, pick up yourself after we would send along recommendations.
Okay, so we're talking about affordable housing and we're a really small city and there's multiple types of housing. There's large complexes, there's the ADUs. And everybody talks about affordable housing, but it's good to define what that metric is. What is the financial metric for that? Where does it make the most sense to spend the most time to do it? Because a lot of what you're talking about, you have to depend on other people to buy, develop, or do something. And would it be better to try to work something out with the new owners of the mall where you could get more concentrated housing faster than you might be able to get it out in a neighborhood? Those are the definitions that I think it would be good to define. How much housing are you looking for? Because we are only 3.5 square miles, so we are limited by how many of things that we can actually do. And there's also, if your goal is to provide housing for people, there's other things that are available that don't require any development at all. So those are the things I think would be good to define before you, because you're going to go down, everybody would go down a rabbit hole unless these things are defined and you have a metric in which to shoot for. Other than that, you're just going along. I think that, everybody gets caught up with affordable housing. It's coming down from Olympia. When you ask, some of our senators about where are they getting this information, it's from master builders. So they're driving this affordable housing push. And our city is unique because we don't have the land that Shoreline and Kenmore does. So we have to be very strategic about what we're able to do within our confines. So I think defining what it is that the goals are would be good.
Commissioner Larson, do you still have your hand up or?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Council.
Go ahead.
I just want to respond to very quickly. I think correct me if I'm wrong, fellow commissioners, but I think that we were looking at how can we incentivize something. We had to put into code the ability that there's no such thing as a single family lot anymore. We have to allow, whether somebody builds it or not, we have to allow a duplex on every parcel in our city now. And we've talked at length about what incentives are in place in our code that might encourage somebody to build something other than a 3-story townhome. And so that I think that's what we're after. I think this little a affordability and big A affordability and all of that is, you're right. These are really complex pieces, but right now somebody can file to build a duplex on any parcel in our town, and we were hoping that we might put some middle housing incentives in place that would yield something other than just a slew of 3-story townhomes.
All right, thanks. So, Vice Chair Goldman.
Yes, so we have roughly, I think, 20 minutes left in our joint meeting. And what I've heard from a few planning commissioners is a desire for council to get a bit more granular, to give some more specific topics. And so I think that's a good segue for us to go around the horn, and each council member can share 1 or 2 things that they'd like to prioritize. And that's going to be way too many things, of course, but we can see if some common themes start to evolve from that. And so,
And as a quick ask of our person who's driving the computer, Joanne, yeah, if you could put up the parking lot.
I was thinking we could, well,
so it's quick. Councilmember Rosno had his hand up, so let's just start with him.
It was for a question, but I can continue to my a brief version of my list. I started writing and then I just kept going. I'm sure you've all had that experience too at times. But part of the question was, would it be helpful for council in some form to give a definition of affordability for our purposes to guide that discussion a little bit more and narrow it down for the planning commission? Or do you feel like you're having a conversation and we should not stomp on it just yet?
I do think it would be helpful. Are we talking capital A or lowercase a? And then from that, within that, are there areas that you would like us to focus? Because there's a lot of questions about, is there going to be money to kind of put in for capital A affordability? Is the city going to want to pursue partnerships with nonprofits or organizations or community land trusts to do that? Are we talking about just focusing on development regs that are in place now and removing barriers. We've talked about having a developer community stakeholder and an affordable housing community, capital A affordable housing community stakeholder come in. We've got some prompts for them, have a discussion to look at, like what tools we could kind of use for a city of our size, because we don't have a lot of good models that have been shared with us to date that are appropriate for a community of our size and of our nature. So I think to Maddie's point, yeah, we probably do need to narrow down. We can't boil the ocean on this, and some direction from council, and that would be very helpful.
And then in terms of like I said, the list grew, but I mean, the big thing that having just been campaigning on all of this and knocking doors and hearing feedback from folks, a big thing that I was talking to in a lot of the community was looking at neighborhood businesses, which includes both the existing neighborhood commercial zoning and options for letting that expand by some mechanism, but also having what in Bothell was they added to their code neighborhood scale is how they referred to it. We could also sort of think about it as infill retail. There's state legislature has a bill that's been filed the last couple of years that would would require code to allow in garages or ADUs that an acceptable use would be certain categories of business. And so you could have the corner store, you could have a little coffee shop that someone wheels out of their garage and serves their neighbors. I could imagine some places around Horizon View where that could be pretty fun. So, sort of letting a thousand flowers bloom and see where that goes, but obviously corralling that in some responsible way. And to me, that's not in a category of business development, it's in a category of walkability. It's how do we make, if we're going to have a walkable city, people need to be able to have someplace to walk to. And so connecting the residential communities, making it so that there is something within walking distance of someone with a stroller, someone in a wheelchair, all of that. And then to pick one other item out of that, I guess continuing on the theme of walkability, although a lot of these things I put affordability in my longer list, which we can circle back to perhaps, but continuing implementing healthy streets, adding SB 5595, which allows lower speed limits under state law now, down to 10 miles an hour, using tools like WooNerfs and taking some of the street, closing part of the street, using some of the right of way as a little parklet, as a playground, things like that. Exactly what the mechanism is for that needs to be worked out, but I assume that at some point it would touch Planning Commission. So having that on your radar. And then I will, as a affordability thing, I think the bonus conversation I think is something that I'm really interested in thinking about. If people want to go for greater height, greater density, affordability being a factor there, but also thinking about with the climate plan, thinking about things like passive house or mass timber as additional things that might trigger some greater flexibility in what someone's allowed to do if they're doing things through a more environmentally conscious design. Longer list, but I can cut it off.
Councilmember Good?
For me, I think that getting the core tasks done for me is really important because once they're done, they're off your plate and you have more time to focus on other things. So I think figuring out what you need to do with the critical areas, the shoreline master plan would be really good, and to get those off your plate, and then you're free to spend more time on some of the more fun things.
All right, thanks. Councilmember Riddle?
Similar to Councilman Rosenau, distributed neighborhood retail would be something that I would like us to start kind of understanding more about. It's kind of a big step for the community, so it's really an education phase, I think, for us as well as for the community. Expanding the commercial nodes as well, something that I'd be interested in looking at. We do have a couple of commercial nodes that are adjacent to our neighborhood cities, and they have little commercial bits there. So the idea of like looking together and like increasing both our nodes at the same time to create some more spaces for people to work and shop as needed. And then maybe taking a look along State Route 104. Is there any areas there that we could look at, other than obviously where we have whiz kids and stuff? Like, is there anywhere up above that once WashDOT finally gets some money and actually does the complete streets on that highway? It's going to be a really nice highway it'll be bike and walk and cross, hopefully, maybe with a crosswalk or two. And so being sort of anticipating that at some point WashDOT will eventually get to that road. And so let's see what it would look like, and start kind of studying that a little bit in concert with the commercial nodes. I still want to see Perkins one lane. I really do. There's so many benefits to it. There's traffic benefits. There's, it's benefits to the stream. There's benefits to it actually becoming an actual interurban connector. Because right now you take your life into your hands trying to get from Burke Gilman and the big sign says go that way. Um, and so anyways, that's one that I would really love to see us move forward. And then I'm really a fan of simplifying our regulations. I think some challenges can be to especially small developers, affordable housing with capital A developers. If it's really difficult to figure out what they can do, it costs money for them to iterate and come to it. So the simpler it is, without, obviously giving away the farm, but the simpler it is for people to understand, I think we're going to get more development that we actually like. I think those are the ones that I could think of right now off the top of my head.
Thank you. I'm going to move over to this side of the room and ask Councilmember Saunders.
How's that? I'm really glad you brought that up, Semra, because the Perkins topic is something the chief and I are going to be working on this year. So we're really excited about that. It's going to be complicated. There's going to be a lot of people we have to talk to, and but it's our goal. So, yeah.
Thank you. Go to Councilmember Muhlenberg on Zoom.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Furtani. I think the thing that resonates most with me from the conversations I had while canvassing oriented around community connectivity and connection points, I think it piggybacks on the comments of Councilmember Rosenau, which is our neighbors and community members need places that they can walk to. I don't know if that's neighborhood businesses or that's parks or other types of facilities, but how do we engender that type of interconnected relationship between our neighbors? And maybe how do we define residential neighborhood zones that create a sense of community in a particular area that helps our neighbors get to know each other and want to come together as a subset of our community within the area where they live?
Appreciate the comment. Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Vice Chair Goldman now.
Yes, so if I were to boil it down to my top two, the first would be looking into cottage or cluster housing. Looking at that as a way to gently increase density on some of our larger lots in a way that you can have a courtyard, you can still have a good chunk of the lot that's available for trees, so it's maintaining our natural environment while also gently increasing density and building some of those smaller homes that our community needs. So that's one. The second, I think, echoing a few other council members, neighborhood businesses, neighborhood cafes, corner shops. I also come at it from the environmental perspective that our city's biggest source of carbon emissions is transportation. And so anything that makes the city more walkable makes us a more environmentally friendly city. And so having people be able to walk if they just need to get a carton of milk or a loaf of bread rather than drive down to town center. So I think those sort of neighborhood businesses would also be a good addition.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Drew.
Hi there. I'd like to mention one thing that I brought up in the last two commission meetings, and that is a way to address affordability without creating additional housing. And it's called home sharing. And there were 4 articles in the Seattle Times in the last couple of months about this. There are 239,000 empty bedrooms in the 3-county area. 24% of Lake Forest Park housing units are occupied by a single person, while studio and one-bedroom homes make up only 9%. Among seniors in Lake Forest Park, over 50% are housing cost burdened. And I can tell you that living on a block with a lot of seniors, being a senior myself, many of us would like to stay in our homes. And when our spouse passes away, we're faced with a lot of costs, and sometimes we need some assistance. These home sharing programs enable sometimes a young person, a college student, for example, to live in our house and do it in a fashion where everybody is vetted properly. And that's the big barrier. And there are examples within Washington State where this is fairly new, but there's a great deal of success already. Bellingham is a good case study. So I would encourage the council to take a look at the material that I put together that's in the Planning Commission December meeting packet about home sharing, because I think it is the way to get really affordable rents for students, for people working at Safeway and that sort of thing, where otherwise even, a $600,000 house is not going to be affordable.
I really appreciate the initiative you've taken on that. And I think, echoing one of Councilmember Good's earlier ideas, maybe there's a collaboration between you and her that might be a fruitful one. So, all right. Well, I guess I'm left, right? Okay. Great. All right. Well, I want to first thank all the Planning Commission for coming in. These comments have been very illuminating for me in your work, and especially the burden that it sometimes places on your own lives. And being cognizant of that, to answer Commissioner Kaj's question, it seems like the things that I've heard, and Council, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, it's more the let's fix that one thing as opposed to a package of things. And I think that really does seem to be resonant amongst, as far as I can tell, all the comments that I've heard. And I'm just going to add on to that. One of them is that hopefully you'll hear the public comment next hour from our contingent of residents who are here. But we forget there's a third leg to the stool of the Planning Commission and the Council. There's also our residents. And I think in parallel, our residents have been taking the initiative and doing a lot with, for instance, the group you'll hear is community land trusts and what role they can play in increasing the stock of housing, especially for senior citizens and other folks with the small A affordability issue. And I think one of the things that I'd really like to see done then is there anything in our code that really is stopping people from offering it? Obviously, economic incentives are one thing, but if there's some kind of permitting or other kind of blockage, how can we help ease this? And adding on to another idea that I heard earlier, having some pre-approved plans that are, shovel ready essentially would be an amazing, and I think I've talked to builders about this, would be great, basically helping them be able to plan a lot better about what they can do and what their profit margin could be. And I think that would be a valuable thing to look at. So the last thing I want to mention is that, the general walkability idea that's resonated through all the what council, we're going to be a good partner to you. We're starting with the roundabout project on 40th, right? We're hoping to do something with that corridor between that roundabout and town center, hopefully basically making it a lot safer to walk, especially for pedestrians, bicyclists, and multimodal traffic. Similarly, that intersection with 178th, oh my goodness, I've been nearly hit there twice. I have been hit there twice. I've nearly been hit more times than that. But the fact is that basically, both times I was not even in my car. So it really is a concern. One of the things that prevents people from walking to town centers is just literally the approaches are so dangerous. So if there's something we could do in the context of the planning process to figure out how we can make that a much more friendly street, I think that would speak volumes to our needs here. And so with that, I'm going to basically turn the gavel back over to the mayor, who I think has a few closing comments.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to have the last word. Thank you. I do have to have the last word when it comes to closing the meeting, but first of all, I want to say that it is imperative that you all are having fun and having some satisfaction in what you're doing. And I think that over the last few years, we've had these mandates that have come to us from the state, and many of them are very well intentioned and very admirable, and they're very can be very successful in the future. But there's been a bit of whack-a-mole too. We fix something and then they break it. We fix something, then they give us something new. No disrespect to our legislature, they're doing the best that they can with really difficult circumstances. Having said that, I think that you all are now in a place where you probably can do less of the sort of catch up and deadline driven kind of work that you've had to do in the past with the comp plan, et cetera. Shoreline master plan, yes, that needs to be done by end of next year. It's not going to be a huge lift for you. There's a couple other things. When it comes to the question of technical debt, in my world, in the software world, you inherit a piece of code that, you feel like, I got to fix it right now. I got to do all this. And then sometimes it gets built upon, or you go back and fix it and spend a ton of time doing that. I wouldn't worry, honestly. There's so many things in our code that I can look at right now and say, we got to fix that. We got to fix that. What we got to fix that. But looking back right now is not a luxury, apparently, we seem to have in terms of resourcing. I applaud you all for continuing to look forward about what you can do to make things better for the community. Walkability, affordability, whatever the definition of that is, and it's up to the community and you all to decide. And the opportunity, I think, for you in this coming year is to do some of the work that is absolutely required, but also find something in there that really drives you and that you're passionate about, because it has been a lot of heavy lifting for you and very, very strenuous work doing the two a month meetings. It's not something that you've necessarily signed up for. Sometimes it's necessary, absolutely. And the last thing I will say is my job is finding the resources, and whether it's staffing, consultants, or money, honestly. And the administration is committed to trying to do the best we can, working in conjunction with the council and you all, to find the resources that are necessary for you to complete your tasks successfully without overburdening you or overburdening staff. And also, it's also my job to say, when Mark says, "Oh yeah, we can do all this, we can all this," sometimes I have to raise my hand and say, "You have way too much on your plate, Mark." So, having said that, in the spirit of congeniality, it is sometimes necessary to make sure that people and the staff don't feel like they have too much. I think we can resource what you want to do. It really depends on what it looks like. And so I'm fully committed to working with the staff and consultants, to finding consultants to make sure that you can do what you have to do. The work you're doing is immensely important. And I hear it in your voices that you are deeply invested in it. And that is something that our community should be very proud of. Having said that, when it comes to resourcing the Planning Commission, applications, we spoke about this earlier today. We do have one person in the wings right now. If Matt McLean was here, he'd probably tell me if there are any more applications that have recently come in. We're going to try to revamp the system for receipt and acknowledgement of applications. Sometimes, even with the tree board, we've had this situation that I described to I guess it was to you two today, that too many meetings, I apologize, where applications have come in, but the commissioners didn't know that the people had submitted the applications. We had them already in process, ready for confirmation, and then it was, there have been some disconnects. And let's all work together to make sure, if you need to reach out to me and say, "Hey, where is this person said they were interested? Did they send an application?" Please let me know. We're going to make sure that we have a bit of a trifecta when it comes to applications for the tree board, for planning commission, and other volunteer organizations between Mark, myself, and Clerk McLean. I will leave it there. I deeply, and I know the council deeply thanks you for your volunteering. It's not an easy job. And I'm hopeful that this year is one where you can feel really satisfied with the work that you've done, that you're doing, and looking forward to additional exciting projects. So with that, council members, is there anything else for the good of the order, or should we, and Chair Castic, did you have any other comments? Okay. We want to stop right on time here. And with that, we will call this adjourned. I wish we had more time, honestly. This is a very good conversation, and maybe we'll make that happen here in the time willing. So thank you, everybody. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.